Hello everyone and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We are holding in Mishnah Berurah Chelik Vav. We will be learning today B'Yetz Hashem Daf Yud Beis Amud Aleph. We're continuing to learn Hilchos Chol HaMoed, and we begin today a new Siman Taf Kuf Mem, Dine Binyan Ustira B'Chol HaMoed, the halachas that govern building and destroying, demolishing on Chol HaMoed, Ubay Ches Seifim. And here in this siman we have 8 seifim. Says the Mechaber in Sif Aleph, binyan, building, constructing, afilu kol shehu, even a minute amount, aser is forbidden on Chol HaMoed. Of course, binyan is one of the lamites melachos. The act of building is a melacha, and as such, it is forbidden on Chol HaMoed unless it falls into the one of the categories that are mutter. If it's a davar ha'avod, if you have to build something in a case of a davar ha'avod, so then it will be mutter. If there's a tzarech hamoyed, it will be mutter under certain circumstances and with certain qualifications. But the opening shot of the mechaber is binyan afilu kol shehu aser. Doing the act of building, even in the most minute amount, is forbidden on Chol HaMoed as a malacha. Says the Mishnah Berurah nice cotton aleph, binyan afilu kol shehu aser. Hainu afilu l'tzarech hamoyed. This is a very interesting Mishnah Berurah. The Chavetz Chaim says that binyan is even forbidden when it's done l'tzarech hamoyed, even if there's a necessity to do it for the needs of Yom Tov, d'lo hutar mishum zeh ela melachos hedyot. Because while it's true that we're going to have cases where acts of binyan, acts of building, are mutter to some extent on Chol HaMoed when they're being done l'tzarech hamoyed, we're only going to be matter them if it's a ma'aseh hedyot, if it's done in a non-professional way, or it's done with a shinui. We're not going to be matir outright binyan. And the reason I say that this Mishnah Berurah is interesting to me is because the way the Mishnah Berurah writes it is, he says binyan, the Mechaber says binyan afilu kol shehu aser, binyan, even in the most minute amount, is forbidden. That is true. Afilu l'tzarech hamoyed. Binyan is aser, even l'tzarech hamoyed. Now, what do you mean binyan is aser, even l'tzarech hamoyed? When binyan needs to be done l'tzarech hamoyed, we are matir binyan if it's done as a ma'aseh hedyot, if it's done in an amateurish way, or even if it's done by a professional, if he does it with a shinoi, then we are matir binyan. So what does the Chavetz Chaim mean that binyan is completely aser, even l'tzarech hamoyed? Reading between the lines, I think what the Chavetz Chaim is saying over here is that the reason why the ma'aseh hedyot is mutter when it's l'tzarech hamoyed, and the reason why it's mutter with a shinoi when it's tzarech hamoyed, is because then it's not really binyan. You see, there's a difference between malacha that's aser on Shabbos and malacha that's aser on Chol HaMoed. For instance, we're going to see that there are things, for instance, in Sif Beis. In Sif Beis, the Mechaber is going to say that if you have a house with an earthen floor and there's a clump of dirt, there's a mound of dirt on the floor, you're allowed to remove it on Chol HaMoed. Now, wait a second. On Shabbos, that would be aser. On Shabbos, if you have a house with an earthen floor and you have a clump of dirt, a mound of dirt on the floor, you're not allowed to remove it. The reason you're not allowed to remove it is because that's called boneh. That fits under the rubric of the malacha of boneh on Shabbos. So that would be an iser malacha on Shabbos. You're not allowed to do it. So how come you're allowed to do it on Chol HaMoed? Yet he doesn't say that it has to be l'tzarech hamoyed. It has to. No, it just, you're allowed to do it in the perfectly normal way. Why? Because it's a malacha she'ein by tercha. There's no tercha, there's no exertion involved in it at all. There's no involvement at all. You just take a broom and you knock it away. So therefore on Chol HaMoed, it's mutter. So you see, the bar for what's aser as a malacha is different on Chol HaMoed than it is on Shabbos. And I think, again, in this Mishnah Berurah Ois Katan Aleph, to me, what the Chavetz Chaim is saying is, boneh is aser on Chol HaMoed. Even in the most minute amount, even if it's l'tzarech hamoyed. But what does boneh mean? Really, boneh means professional work, lasting work done by a professional in a professional way. If you're not a professional, if you're doing a maisa hedyet, if you're doing the work of an amateur, or you're a professional but you're doing it with a shinoi, then it's not really boneh. And that's why it's mutter if it's being done l'tzarech hamoed. It's still not mutter if you're not doing it l'tzarech hamoed, but if it's l'tzarech hamoed, it's mutter. I hope that makes sense. To me, it does. Okay. So again, let's go back to the Mechaber. So the Mechaber said, Binyan afilu kol shu aser. Binyan is aser even in the most minute amount on Chol HaMoed because it's a malacha. However, ve'im nifratz geder ginasai. Let's say you have a wall around your garden. You have a nice vegetable garden. You have a wall around your garden. And the wall becomes breached. Oy, the Ramah says, Oy kaisel chatseroi shebeinoi lachaveroi. Or you have a chatzer, you share some kind of yard together with your friend, and you have a wall that separates your yard from his yard. And that wall becomes breached. In that case, says the Mechaber, Beineu maisei hedyet. You could repair it, you could repair that breach if you do it as a maisei hedyet. If you're an amateur and you build it in an amateurish way, or even if you're a professional mason, but you go ahead and you build it in an amateurish way, or you do it with a shinoi. And the Mechaber explains what this means. Tahainu shemaniach avonim zu al zu. All you do is you take building stones and you pile one on top of the other. Ve'enoi toch betit, but you don't use any mortar. So this is not a professionally built wall. This is just a pile of stones. So it's a way of temporarily filling the breach. So if your wall became breached on Yom Tov, or it became breached right before Yom Tov, so you weren't able to fix this in any way before Yom Tov, and now it's Chol HaMoed, and you have this breach in your wall, you're allowed to repair the breach if you do it as a maisa hedyet or you do it with a shinoi. Let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah Ice Cotton Bays. Geder ginasai, or either the wall around your garden, or a wall that's between your chutzner and your neighbor's chutzner, shebeinoi lechaveroi. So, the Chavetz Chaim says here, let's analyze this case. Why are we going to be matir anything over here? What's the basis for the heter? Is it a davar avud? If it's a davar avud, then we wouldn't be matir only a maisa hedyet. If it's a davar avud, we'd be matir a maisa uman. We would be matir you to rebuild the wall kedarkoi in the perfectly normal way. We learned that already all the way in the beginning in Siman Tavkov Lamed and in Siman Tavkov Lamed Zayin, where we did the halachas of davar avud. We said right away, davar avud mutar la'asai b'chol HaMoed b'loi shinoi. When something is a davar avud, you're allowed to do malach in the perfectly normal way. You don't need a shinoi, and it doesn't have to be a maisa hedyet. So if it's mutter to rebuild this wall, to repair the wall because of a davar avud, then it wouldn't be restricted to only a maisa hedyet. So therefore, says the Chavetz Chaim in Ice Cotton Bays, the lekal amechash liganove. We must be talking about a case here where we're not concerned for ganovim. We're not concerned that people are going to come into your garden and steal all of your cucumbers. If that's what we were afraid of, then it would be a davar avud. If we were afraid that people are going to come into your yard and steal your barbecue grill and your kids' bikes, then it would be a davar avud. Then it wouldn't be restricted to a maisa hedyet. Even a maisa uman would be mutter. Ella mishum shara nashim sheyikansu sham. The only thing that we're afraid of over here is that a couple of people might walk into your yard. They might walk through your garden. And by walking through your garden, they might do a certain limited amount of damage. You know, they might kick your tomato plant and break off a branch. They might trample one cucumber or something like that. We're not talking about a serious loss over here. And therefore, it's not a davar ha'avud. Lefikach, therefore, loihutar ki maisa hedyet. That's why the Mechaber says the only thing that's mutter over here is to make a repair that's a maisa hedyet, but not a repair that's a maisa uman. Now, if it's not a davar ha'avud, why is anything mutter? It's malacha, it's still binyan. Why are you allowed to do any binyan? And the answer must be because it's a tzarech hamoed. Over here, you're right, it's binyan, which is aser on Chol HaMoed, but if it's done l'tzarech hamoed, then as long as it's a maisa hedyet, you're allowed to do it. Why is this a tzarech hamoed? I guess the reason it's a tzarech hamoed, first of all, right now it's Yom Tov, and you don't want to you're very uncomfortable because you have people walking through your property. It's the Moed. Maybe you want vegetables from your garden, and you have a couple of beautiful, nice, ripe tomatoes over there. And even though you're not going to take a significant financial loss if just a few tomatoes get ruined, but if the 5 beautiful, ripe tomatoes that you're counting on for your salad get ruined, so that's a Chol HaMoed. Your chutzner that's between you and your neighbor, you're not going to have any privacy. You want to invite people over in, pre-COVID-19 terms. You want to invite people over and you want to have a barbecue with your family on Chol HaMoed, and now you can't. You have no privacy in your backyard. So it's a Chol HaMoed. So the repair to the wall around the garden or the repair to the wall in your chutzner is a Chol HaMoed. And since it's a Chol HaMoed, the melachos is mutter as long as it's restricted to a Maaseh Hedyot and not a Maaseh Uman. Now we go to Ois Cotton Gimel. So the Mechaber said, what's called a Maaseh Hedyot? He said you pile up the stones and you don't use any mortar. You don't cement them together. Says the Chafetz Chaim Ois Cotton Gimel, ve'enoi tach betit, tahaticha betit hu Maaseh Uman. The use of cement, that's the part of the job which is a Maaseh Uman. And the truth is, I remember many times watching masons at work, and it really is a Maaseh Uman. First of all, you have to mix up, and I had personal experience with this once, many, many years ago, when a set of my front brick steps, the bricks got loose and fell out, and I decided how hard could it be to fix this myself. So I went and I mixed up cement, and I broke out the old cement, and I put in new cement, and I leveled the bricks, and everything looked beautiful. And I covered it up with plastic sheeting, and then in the morning I came out, and all of my steps were like sunk in the middle. Apparently I didn't mix the cement thick enough. But there you watch the masons at work and the way they mix the cement and then the way they slap it down and smooth it out. This is a Maaseh Uman. So aticha betit to Maaseh Uman. But the Chafetz Chaim says when we talk about working with tit, working with mortar, and we call it a Maaseh Uman, v'daf gezeh she'oisa oisa im melachos hagoder. When we say that working with cement, when working with mortar is a Maaseh Uman, that's when you're building a wall. Ma she'ein kein lahatiach hagag betit. But when we talk about smearing tit, whether it's some kind of loose mortar or something, or pitch onto a roof to level a roof, that's considered a Maaseh Hedyot, v'shari l'tzarech hamoed, and that's mutter when it's being done l'tzarech hamoed. V'chein asiyah sulam Maaseh Hedyot hu, he says also slapping together a makeshift ladder is also called a Maaseh Hedyot, v'shari l'tzarech hamoed, and it would be mutter if it's done l'tzarech hamoed. So if on Chol HaMoed sukkahs you need a ladder to climb up and adjust your shlach on your sukkah, if you're just slapping together a makeshift ladder, he says that's considered a Maaseh Hedyot. V'ayin b'Pri Megadim, however, he says, take a look at the Pri Megadim, to lahatiach stokim shebagag, if you're going up to your roof because you have leaks in your roof, and now you're identifying the leaks and you're filling the leaks, that's Maaseh Uman Nikra. That's already called a Maaseh Uman. The Maaseh Hedyot is when you're doing, so to speak, grubba work. When you're doing coarse work, you're just taking tit, pouring it down on the roof and smoothing it out, that's a Maaseh Hedyot. But once you're already identifying leaks and filling small cracks, that's already elevated to a Maaseh Uman. Kidala Kamon b'Sif Gimel, like we're going to see in Sif Gimel. V'hacha metaychay rak sheyeh cholok. When we say that smoothing out a roof is a Maaseh Hedyot, that's just, smoothing out the tit. Over Medina Seinu ein motzi zeh. The Chafetz Chaim says that in his locales this was not found too often. Uba asiyah sulam gam kein, when it comes to making a ladder also. Chafetz Chaim says, when I told you that building a ladder is a Maaseh Hedyot, im miapeyu kederech ha'umnim. If you go and you make a beautiful ladder, you make beautiful joints and everything else, so then already, bevadai Maaseh Umanu, that's a Maaseh Umanu, v'asar af l'tzarech hamoed, and that would be forbidden even if you're doing it l'tzarech hamoed. When I told you that it's mutter, that's to slap together a makeshift ladder in a rudimentary fashion. That's a Maaseh Hedyot. To make a beautiful ladder is, of course, a Maaseh Uman. Now we go back to the Mechaber. So the Mechaber said that if you have to fix this breach in your wall, you could do it as a Maaseh Hedyot, and he gave an example, pile up stones and don't use mortar. Now we go to the third line down in the middle of the line, right by the Ois Daled for the Mishnah Berurah. Or the Mechaber says, I'll give you another eitzah of how you could repair this breach as a Maaseh Hedyot. Goyder oisai bekonim, you could fence off the breach using reeds, the goime, and like a string, the kayotze behem, or anything like that. So now it's mamish not a maisa uman. What you're doing is you're just erecting some kind of a temporary mechitza to block up the breach in the wall. I guess the example nowadays would be if you have a wall around a piece of your property. So to do a maisa uman, that would mean to really get the proper fencing and put in the fence posts the right way and go ahead and stretch the fencing and wire it to the posts. But what you might do instead is go to Home Depot and get a roll of that orange netting and just take a couple of cable ties and fasten it with a couple of cable ties. That would be a maisa hedyot. That's not a maisa uman. Says the Mishnah Berurah, nice cotton dalit, oy goyder oy say. Now the Chavetz Chaim makes a diuk here in the words of the Mechaber, but it's really not a diuk in the words of the Mechaber. It's really a diuk in the Mishnah in Moed Cotton. The Mishnah in Moed Cotton, this halacha that you're allowed to repair the breach in the fence, comes from the Mishnah in Moed Cotton. I think I might have it here. Let's see. The Mishnah in Moed Cotton. The Mishnah in Moed Cotton says, where is it? Yud Aleph? Zion maybe. Vav Beis. The Mishnah says, "Mekarin es apirtza b'moed." You could repair a breach in a fence on Chol HaMoed. So the Chavetz Chaim says over here, if the Mishnah tells me that you could repair a breach, says the Mishnah Berurah, nice cotton dalid, mashma l'chara, the implication is the dafka tikun pertza ba'alma. The only thing that's mutter is to repair a breach. Haligdar kol hagina, but to put up a new fence around the entire garden, maisa hedyot nami aser. That would be aser even if you were doing just a maisa hedyot. So let's say what happened was you had a garden and your garden didn't have a fence around it at all. And now on Chol HaMoed, you have beautiful ripe tomatoes, beautiful ripe cucumbers and zucchinis. And now suddenly you notice that people are walking through your garden. And you say to yourself, all right, it's a tzarech HaMoed. I want to protect my vegetables for the Moed. And I want to protect my privacy for the Moed. Till now, I never had a fence. I guess now I need a fence. So I know I'm not allowed to do a maisa uman. So I'll just go get a couple of knock-in posts. And I'll get the rolls of the orange netting. And I'll put up a fence around the entire garden. That, the Mishnah Berurah says, it would seem is aser, even though what you're doing is a maisa hedyot. Now, why would that aser? Why would that be aser? So this comes from the Pri Megadim, and if I read the Pri Megadim properly, it seems that this already is aser because of tircha yisera. If you're already putting up a fence, there's a difference between making a repair and putting up a fence from scratch. Once you're putting up a fence from scratch, that already rises to the level of tircha yisera. Tircha yisera is aser on Chol HaMoed, even if you're doing it l'tzarech HaMoed, unless it's mamish davar avod. And even in cases where it's mamish davar avod, we saw earlier that there are cases where something is mamish davar avod, and if it's a tircha yisera, it's aser. I'll give you an example. We had the classical case. The classic case of a davar avod that's mutter on Chol HaMoed is a stay beis hashlachin. If you have a field that has to be watered manually, it doesn't get enough water from rainfall, then you're allowed to water it on Chol HaMoed. But how are you allowed to water it in Chol HaMoed? You're only allowed to water it from a mayin, from a spring that's right there, that's next to the field. So you only have to let the water run in, and maybe all you're going to do is scratch out a little irrigation canal with your foot. But you're not allowed to take a bucket and start drawing water from the well to water your stay beis hashlachin. Why? It's a davar avod. Why isn't that mutter? It's not mutter because that's already tircha yisera. So tircha yisera, we saw already earlier, is a little bit of a complicated area. There are times where tircha yisera, it seems, could be mutter, times that tircha yisera is aser. But very often tircha yisera is aser. So over here, even though it's a tzarech HaMoed, since this is a tircha yisera to make a fence around the whole garden, the Mishnah Berurah says it seems that would be aser. Okay, now let's go back to the Mechaber, the last word on the third line. V'chein im asa maika legag. The same halacha would be true if you want to make a fence around your roof. Now, most of us, when we see the phraseology Maika Legag, we think of the mitzvah. It's a beferish pasuk, V'asisa Maika Legagecha. You're mechuyev to have a fence around your roof, so somebody shouldn't fall off and chas v'shalom get hurt. That's not what this is speaking about. Take a look at the Biur Halacha, Dibra Maschel V'cheinim Asa Maika. Ayin b'chedushay Ritva. The Chofetz Chaim says, take a look in Moed Katan Daf Yud Aleph Amud Aleph in the Ritva. Shakasav, who writes to Mastisin Mayri Begag, that the Mishnah where this halacha is taken from is speaking about a roof Deloy Regili Lahaloichba, that people don't generally go on. She'enoi chayiv b'maika, and therefore it doesn't have a chi of maika. Ella, so why is this guy making a maika? Ella shehu ba'atzmai writes alasais mishum shmira. Maybe now on Chol HaMoed, this person realizes that he has a need to go up to the roof. He knows he's going to have to go up to the roof. He wants a fence around the roof. But it's not for the mitzvah of maika. This roof is not mechuyev in a maika. But he's going up because he wants to make a fence around his roof. Skip the brackets here in the Biur Halacha. Because the Ritva says, Di mishum mitzvahs maika, if this was talking about a roof that was chayiv in maika, lama lo yasek kedarkoi. Then the Ritva says, you would be allowed to build a maika around the roof in the perfectly normal way, maisa uman, without a shinoi. So if the Mechaber says over here that if you want to make a maika around your roof, you have to do it as a maisa hedyet, that means that we're not talking about the mitzvah of maika. We're talking about a case where there is no chiyuv of maika. So therefore, back to the Mechaber. The Mechaber said, "V'cheinim asa maika legag." If you're making this optional maika around your roof, boneh isay maisa hedyet, you have to build it as a maisa hedyet. Aval, however, says the Mechaber, kaisel chatzer hasamach l'rishus harabim shenafal. Let's say you have a yard that abuts onto the rishus harabim, and that wall gets breached. In that case, says the Mechaber, baineyu kedarkoi. Now you already could do it in the perfectly normal way, because now we're dealing with a davar avud. If you have a wall, if you have a yard that abuts onto the rishus harabim, all types of people walk in the rishus harabim. There are unfortunately ganavim that walk in the rishus harabim as well. And if your yard is breached to the rishus harabim, especially in the days of the Mishnah, the Gemara, the Rishonim, the yard was used for tashmishay habayis. They did their cooking. They had their oven out in the yard. They did their laundry out in the yard. So they kept kalim of all types outside in the yard. If your yard is breached to the rishus harabim, now you have to worry about ganavim. If you're worried about ganavim, now it's a davar avud. If it's a davar avud, then malacha is mutter even as a maisa uman. Says the Mishnah Berurah, nice cut and hay. Hasamach l'rishus harabim, tal yidei zeshu samach l'rishus harabim. Now that your yard is breached to the rishus harabim, ikapsei the yisera. Now we're talking about a significant financial loss. Da'il sham ganave, because now ganave could come into your yard. V'davar ha'avadu, and now we're speaking about a davar ha'avad, v'loi boi shinoi. Now you don't need a shinoi, and you don't need a maisa hedyet. Now you can do it in a perfectly normal way, even as a maisa uman. V'hu adin, and the same halacha would apply, says the Chofetz Chaim, the wall between your yard and your neighbor's yard. We said in the beginning of Sif Aleph that if the wall falls down between you and your neighbor, we said that's not called a davar ha'avad. You could fix it as a maisa hedyet. Now, says the Chofetz Chaim, im yesh sham anashim shechashudim al hagneva, if your neighbor is somebody who might be a ganef, or if you have non-Jewish neighbors next door, then then you're allowed to rebuild and repair the wall in the perfectly normal way. But the Chofetz Chaim does bring down a Magen Avram that says an interesting concept that we had earlier as well. V'ayin Magen Avram, he says, take a look at the Magen Avram, even in a case like this, where we're dealing with the davar ha'avad, we're only going to be matir one malacha. We're not going to be matir two malachas. What does that mean? Tahainu livnoisai imhu kfar soser. If the wall fell down, if the wall became breached, you could go do the malacha of boneh and you could rebuild the wall because it's a davar ha'avad. Aval lisasrai imhu ra'ua v'livnoisai mechadash. How about if you walk outside and you see that the wall between your yard and the Rishus Harabim is very, very flimsy, and it looks like it's not in good shape. So now you want to demolish it in order to rebuild it. So now you want to do the malacha of soser and the malacha of boneh. So now you want to be matir two malachas. Lo yitiru, that the Magen Avraham says we're not matir, im lo mipnei sakana ukidila kamei, unless there's a question of sakana, like we're going to see shortly. The Kosav HaPrima Gadam, the Prima Gadam writes, the Efsher Shemahu Ra'ua Kol Kach Sheyesh Chash Borer, the Prima Gadam says, if your wall between your yard and the Rishus Harabim, or between your chutzner and the non-Jews' chutzner, is mamish so weak that it looks like it's going to certainly collapse, the Kol Sheken Echa Sheyesh Chash Sheyavayu Aganavim Gamli De Iske Nefashos, or certainly if you live in a terrible neighborhood and you're not only worried that bad guys might come in and steal, but you're worried that bad guys might come in with a mind to do murder, chas v'chalila, shari listar v'liv nice, then definitely it's mutter to do both the malacha of stira and binyan. However, you always have to keep in mind that you shouldn't plan to be doing this work on Chol HaMoed. Don't leave it from before Yom Tov to Chol HaMoed. Okay, now we go back to the Mechaber, 5 lines down. Let's say you have a wall that's mamish about to collapse. Then then you're allowed to knock down the wall to avoid danger, and you could rebuild it in the perfectly normal fashion. So again, we just had a Magen Avraham. The Magen Avraham just told us in Mishnah Berurah Ois Katan Hey that if what you're worried about is financial loss, then the Magen Avraham says we're only matir one malacha. We would be matir boneh. You could go repair your wall to avoid financial loss. But we would not be matir two malachas. We wouldn't be matir you to knock down the wall, do soser, and then rebuild it with binyan. Now the Mechaber is telling me, how about if you have a wall that looks like it's going to collapse out onto the Rishus Harabim, or out onto your neighbor's chutzner, or into your chutzner, and you're afraid somebody might get hurt. If somebody is walking by when the wall collapses, it could collapse on top of him, and he can get hurt. In that case, the Mechaber says, now there's a question of sakana. Now you're allowed to knock the wall down in order to avoid sakana, and then after you knock it down, you're allowed to rebuild it. Why? Why is it mutter to rebuild it? Says the Mishnah Berurah here in Ois Katan Vav, live nice, because if we're not going to be matter you to rebuild the wall on Chol HaMoed, yimane v'lo yistar. You're going to refrain from knocking it down. You're going to say, listen, I don't want to go a whole Yom Tov now without a wall between me and the Rishus Harabim, or between me and my non-Jewish neighbors. I want to have a wall. So, yeah, it looks like the wall is very weak and it might fall down, but I'm not knocking it down. I'm going to hope for the best. But we don't want you to hope for the best. There might be a danger here. So we want you to knock it down. But you're only going to knock it down if you're going to be allowed to rebuild it. So we're matir seifai, we're matir seifai bishum tchilasai. We're matir you to rebuild it at the end because we want to make sure that you're going to knock it down. Okay, now we go to the Ramah. Haggah. Even if this wall that's in bad shape is not leaning out towards the Rishus Harabim, it's only leaning out to your yard or to an alleyway, so it is not, doesn't seem to be that much of a chash v'sakana. Still says the Ramah, sakana, you're allowed to knock it down but to avoid sakana, v'lachzar v'livnaisai, and you're allowed to rebuild it. Continues the Ramah, so too, in any other instance where we're worried about danger, you're allowed to build and demolish in the perfectly normal way. You don't need a shinoi. It doesn't have to be a ma'aseh hedyot. Now we go to Sif Beis. Says the Mechaber. Mutter lital gavshushis shababayis, like I told you earlier in the shir, if you have an earthen floor and you have a mound on the floor, you're allowed to remove it on Chol HaMoed. Says the Mishnah Berurah Nice Katan Zayin, gavshushis shababayis, shelo yitakel bam. Why are you removing it? So that nobody should trip. Or mutter lital afilu kedarka, you could do it in a perfectly normal way. Da'af the malacha gemurahi, even though this is 100% a malacha, that removing a mound of earth from the earthen floor is the malacha of binyan, you're improving your house. Ub'Shabbos chayav al zeh mishum boneh, and like I told you earlier, if you did this on Shabbos, you'd be 100% chayav a daraisa, so you'd be over on an issa daraisa because of the malacha of boneh. Ve'enoi davar ha'avud, and this is not a davar ha'avud. Ulutzarech hamayid ba'alma enoi shari kiyim b'shinoi, and you'll tell me that it's a tzarech hamayid. Yes, it's a tzarech hamayid because I don't want to trip on Yom Tov, so it's a tzarech hamayid. But even if it's a tzarech hamayid, you're only allowed to do it either as a ma'aseh hedyet or with a shinoi. So when it comes to removing a mound from the ground, there is no such thing as a ma'aseh hedyet. An uman, a professional, and a hedyet are both going to do it the same way, but then you have to do it with a shinoi l'chayr. So why are we matter you over here to do it perfectly normally without a shinoi? Explains the Chavetz Chaim, and this is a very important rule to remember. Afilu hachi materinon afilu kedarkoi. Over here, we're matter you to do it 100% in the normal way kedarkoi. Mishum de netilas kashushis les patarach. Because over here, there's no exertion. And on Chol HaMoed, when we aser malacha on Chol HaMoed, let's remember that the foundation for the iser malacha on Chol HaMoed is tercha. We don't want to take you away from what you're supposed to be doing on the Moed. On the Moed, you're supposed to be busy with Simchas Yom Tov. You're supposed to be busy with Torah. You're supposed to be busy with Tefillah. That's why we aser any malacha, and we aser anything like business that has tirda and that has tircha. But removing the gavshushis from the ground has no tircha. So since it's a malacha she'ein by tircha, there's no tircha at all. Since there is a tzarech hamayid, we're matter you to do it in the perfectly normal way. Okay, Siv Gimel. Stokim mishabagag. If you have cracks in the roof, mutter l'sasman biyad uberegel, you're allowed to fill them using your hand or using your feet. Avaloi b'klei umnus, but you're not allowed to go get a trowel. So you have cracks in the roof and you want to go fill them. You could go up to the roof and you could take some shmirats, you could take some pitch or whatever it is and smack it down with your hand, tamp it down with your foot, but you can't go get a trowel and trowel it down. So in English, you're allowed to do a ma'aseh hedyet, you're not allowed to do a ma'aseh uman. Now, let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah. Why are you doing this? And what's the heter for doing this? Says the Mishnah Berurah is cut in ches, stuck in shebagag, shahamayim yordim derech sham. Now, the Chavetz Chaim is bringing down from the Torah that the problem over here is you have cracks in the roof, and therefore water is getting in. And therefore, yachal l'sasban b'yad baragel. So you're allowed to repair this with your hand or with your feet. Dahainu shebayit b'yad baregel. You bang with your hand or with your feet. Listay mastakin to fill up the cracks. Even if you do a very nice job, mamish the way they would do it with a trowel, you're very gifted, and you could do it with your hand or with your foot, mamish, a beautiful job, gam ken shari, that's still mutter. The kol ze nikra ma'aseh hedyet, because that's called a ma'aseh hedyet. You're not doing it in the professional way. You're doing it in an amateurish way. Ice cut and test, avaloi b'klei umnus. But you're not allowed to do this with a trowel. You're not allowed to do it with professional tools. Tehu malacha gemura, because this is mamish the malacha of binyan. V'yesh b'torach, and it's a malacha sheyesh by tercha. There is an involvement, and there is a busyness involved, and there is exertion involved in doing this. V'asar afilu l'tzarech hamayid, and therefore, even though you're doing it l'tzarech hamayid, you're not allowed to do a ma'aseh uman. You're only allowed to do a ma'aseh hedyet. Now, I'm going to stop here for a second, because many of you might be asking the question, I don't understand. If there's a leak in the roof, that's a davar avod. If it's a davar avod, then it's mutter even a ma'aseh uman. So why are we only being matter over here a ma'aseh hedyet? So let's take a look at the Bir Halacha, Dibur HaMaskel, Stokim Shebagag. The Chavetz Chaim says, Ayin mi Mishnah Berurah. Take a look in the Mishnah Berurah, B'mashe kasavnu b'shem HaTorah, what I quoted from the Torah, Shahamayim yordim derech sham. That was speaking about a case where there are cracks in the roof and water is getting in. Ha ha ha. Uritzayna loymar, explains the Chavetz Chaim. Uritzayna loymar lanias daiti. In my humble opinion, what the Torah means is not that water is getting in. Sheyuchal leirei derech sham. What the Torah means is that water can get in. Water is not getting in. Why? Says the Chofetz Chaim here. We're not talking about that the rain is leaking into the house. And it's clear that way from the Ritva. These are the words of the Ritva. Pirish kisha'osin mipnech shash hagishamim. You're allowed to do this in a Maisa Hedyot way, and you're not allowed to do it in a Maisa Uman way if there's a chash of Gishamim, if there's a chance that rainwater is going to get in. Avalim bo Gishamim mavish, but if the water is getting in, va'adayin yidloif babayis, and it's mamish leaking into the house, then you're allowed to repair this in the perfectly normal way as a Maisa Uman without a shinoi. She'ein adam darba mayid b'diras rucha. You're not mechuyev to live on Yom Tov in a diras rucha. A diras rucha means a disgusting, uninhabitable house. You don't have to live on Yom Tov in a leaking house. Now, what does that mean? On face value, when I say that, it sounds like what I'm saying is I don't got to live in a leaking house on Yom Tov, and therefore I'm allowed to do malacha on Chol HaMoed. If there's a heter to do malacha on Chol HaMoed, it has to fall under a rule. What rule is it falling under? So let's see. So the Chofetz Chaim, the Biur Halacha says now, va'oid, and furthermore, she'ein lecha davar ha'ovid gadol mizeh. There's no bigger davar ha'ovid than having a leak in your roof and water coming into the house. But look at what the Chofetz Chaim says. He said va'oid, furthermore. So that means that there's more than one heter here. One heter that the Chofetz Chaim is giving you is, if you mamish have a leak in your roof, you're allowed to repair it, even as a Maisa Uman, because it's a davar ha'ovid. But he says va'oid. That means that there's another heter. What's the other heter? L'chara, the other heter is that to have a shelter, to have a clean, dry, safe shelter, that's considered one of the primary needs of a person. That's tzarich haguf. What are the primary needs of a person? The primary needs of a person are water, food, and shelter. So shelter is a primary need, tzarich haguf, that is equated with Eichel Nefesh. And Tzarech Eichel Nefesh, malacha that's a Tzarech Eichel Nefesh, is mutter on Chol HaMoed, even a Maisa Uman. So again, when the Mechaber says over here in Siv Gimel, that if you have a crack in your roof, you're allowed to repair it with your hand and with your foot, but not with clay umnis, because it's only mutter to do a Maisa Hedyot. It's not mutter to do a Maisa Uman. And then in the Mishnah Berurah, the Chofetz Chaim said that it means that there's cracks in the roof and water's getting in. It doesn't mean that water is getting in. It means that water could get in. If you're worried that water might get in, then you could do the repair, but you have to do the repair as a Maisa Hedyot, because it's not a davar ha'ovid. It's tzarech hamoed, but tzarech hamoed is only mutter, a Maisa Hedyot, not a Maisa Uman. But if the water is getting in, then first of all, it's tzarech Eichel Nefesh, and second of all, it's a davar ha'ovid. Then you're allowed to do even a Maisa Uman. Okay. Now let's continue in Mishnah Berurah Ois Cotton Test. Says the Chofetz Chaim, v'dan you should know. The chol davar shematirin l'tzarech hamoed b'Maisa Hedyot. Whenever we say that something is mutter, that malacha is mutter on Chol HaMoed, if you do it in an amateurish way, if you do it as a Maisa Hedyot, hu dafka shelo yechavin malachta b'moed. We always have to remember that yes, it's mutter to do something l'tzarech hamoed as a Maisa Hedyot if you didn't plan to do it on Chol HaMoed. You can't decide before Yom Tov, I'm going to put this off until Chol HaMoed, and I'll do it in Chol HaMoed as a Maisa Hedyot. No, you're not allowed to push it off. It's mutter on Chol HaMoed if you couldn't do it before Yom Tov. Now let's do Sif Daled, or at least the beginning of Sif Daled. Tzir Hadeles, the pivot of a door. The doors in those days were made. You had your slab, that was the door, and the door had on it pins. There was a pin on top and a pin on bottom, and the pins went into holes in the door frame, and that's how the door pivoted. So tzir hadeles, the pivot of the door, v'hamafteach, or the key, v'hamanol, the lock, v'hatzinor, the tzinor, a tzinor is literally a pipe. The tzinor is the sleeve in the floor that the pivot of the door goes into. v'hakora, or the lintel on top of the door frame that the top pivot of the door goes into. Bein shehem shel eitz, whether we're talking about these items constructed out of wood, bein shehem shel barzel, or if they're made out of metal, shenishberu, if any of these items broke, afilu me'erev Yom Tov, even if it broke on Erev Yom Tov, yachal l'sakna b'lo shinoi, you're allowed to repair these in the normal way, without a shinoi, even a maisa uman. Why? Mipnei shezeh hefsid gadol hu, because now we're talking about a serious davar avud. Shem yaniach ha'pesach basuach, if you leave your door open, udelasai shavurais, you leave your doors broken and your doors wide open, nimtzam abed kamash babayis, you're going to lose everything that's in the house. So you can't leave your door wide open. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cutting yud. Tzir hadeles, the pivot of the door, kamai hadeles tisaiv al tzira, which is a pasuk from Mishlei that says the door swings on its pivot. Regal adeles haseveves, it's the pivot that the door swings on. Ais cutting yud aleph hatzinar, what's the tzinar? Hu char, this is the hole or the sleeve. Sheba askufa hatachtaina, that's on the threshold on the floor. Shadeles seivev ba, by the pivot goes into that tzinar and it turns in the tzinar. Va'akira, and the lintel, hu hamashkoiv sha'ala pesach, that's the lintel above on the door frame. Mashechezeres by adeles, again that the delis swings in. Ice cotton yud beis, the Mechaber said whether they're made out of wood or they're made out of iron, what's the difference? Bein shem shel barzel, Ritzayin Elomer, what the Mechaber wants to say is, av sheboy nishmar kol hapatish kishem esaknoi, even though when you're repairing a metal door, it's much more avsha milsa, there's much greater publicity of malacha involved, because when you bang on it with a hammer, it makes a lot more noise. Ice cutting yud gimel, if these things shenishberu that they broke, so too if you have to affix the lintel with nails, the lintel is loose and you have to fix it in place. Shari, this is mutter and yesh lachish laganvi, if you have to worry about ganavim. V'em lav, and if you're not worried about ganavim, you live in a very, very safe gated neighborhood, so your mamish not worried about ganavim, everybody leaves their doors open. V'em lav, then avzel aser, then everything is aser. Okay, we're going to stop over here, so we'll just have to do it the Ramah tomorrow. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. The discussion of limud HaTorah should be made against Klal Yisrael, and we should be zeicher to see the Bias Gal Tzedek b'meher v'yameinu. Be well.